You recently did a Reddit Ask Me Anything, and one of the people asked you there, what was the most shocking thing that you've seen in your life? And you said, watching peaceful demonstrators being killed by the Soviet army in Lithuania in 1991. I was present when Soviet soldiers attacked the TV tower in Vilnius on the night of January 13th. How does that experience inform the recent experience with publication of the cartoons related to the Prophet Muhammad and the sort of threats of violence and the violent reaction that you experienced?
You know, I was a young reporter back then. I think I was 32 years old. I had just started as a foreign correspondent at the newspaper I used to work at the time, and this came as a total surprise. That there had been a lot of, mice and mouse game between the Soviet army and the demonstrators in Lithuania, and suddenly they attacked, and suddenly it became very violent. I mean, the broader context of this is that I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union. My wife is from the former Soviet Union. I worked as a translator with Russian. And I worked with refugees from the former Soviet Union, and through that experience I got in touch with dissidents in the Eastern Bloc, and you know, the fact that they paid a high price for their willingness to stand up to tyranny and to insist on the right to speak their mind and criticize the political regime in the Soviet Union, even paying for it with long prison terms in labor camps in Siberia and other places, or they were kicked out of their home country. Made a huge impression on me, and I think it was a formative experience that served as the background for my approach to the cartoon crisis. A lot of people in Denmark did not notice that that there was a problem with self-censorship when it came to dealing with Islam almost 10 years ago. But having experienced the evils of self-censorship in the Soviet Union and what it can do to a society. I mean, in the end, when people internalize those limits, the powers that be do not need to use all that much violence. It's only when people stand up to the limitations that the authorities use violence. And the vast majority of people in the Soviet Union had just internalized these things. I will not compare Denmark and Western Europe to the Soviet Union, but it was some of the same mechanism that I saw at play, and that was what we wanted to explore, by commissioning those cartoons and by publishing them, and all the debates that followed.
How much debate preceded the publication of those cartoons, and how surprising was the reaction?
I mean, there was quite a debate within the newspaper, not among reporters, but on the level of editors. We just had one case with a children's writer who had come forward and said that he was writing a book about the life of the Prophet for children, and we do need illustrations of main characters in children's books. And he had problems finding an illustrator. And the one who finally said yes insisted on anonymity, which is a form of self-censorship. You do not want to appear under your own name because you are afraid of the consequences of what you are saying. But there was only that for one example when I commissioned the cartoons. And then they were only published, 2 weeks later, because we were not sure if that was enough documentation to go with that story. But while we were having that debate, we experienced several other cases of self-censorship. There was a museum in London that removed an installation called God is Great because the museum was afraid that it might cause an aggressive reaction from Muslims. There was a similar case in Gothenburg, Sweden, also with a painting that was removed after Some Muslims had complained about that piece of art and demanded that it be removed. There was a translation of a book by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Somalia-born former Dutch politician who is now residing in the US and has been living in hiding for many years. She wrote a book critical of Islam, and the Finnish publisher removed sentences from her work without asking her because they were afraid that it might cause a reaction. And a stand-up comedian in Denmark gave an interview to my newspaper in which he literally said, I'm not afraid of mocking the Bible in front of a camera, but I'm afraid to do the same thing with the Quran. So he was making a difference between the way he would treat two religions when it comes to satire. And then finally there was a meeting in Copenhagen between the Danish Prime Minister and a group of Danish imams. And at that meeting, two of the imams explicitly asked the Prime Minister to interfere with the press, to make his influence on the press in order to get more positive coverage of Islam. And that basically was a call for censorship. I mean, a call to use the tools of state power to get a specific point of view across. So all this happened within the course of 1 or 2 weeks, and it convinced me and my co-editors that, that this was a legitimate story. We had heard about a problem. We tried to find out if it's true or not. And I think we found out, we have enough documentation to go with this story. But of course, we didn't anticipate the kind of reaction that we received, 4 months later with this global uproar. We had expected a debate within Denmark about the limits of free speech, about self-censorship, about how you handle the problems of integration in a multicultural society, but not anything on the magnitude that we experienced a few months later.
Before we started recording, you told me that were you to visit a mosque, you would observe all of the requirements of the people who operate that place, but for the people of Islam or any religion, frankly, to ask you to observe their taboos in public, you equate that to submission to their will.
Absolutely, and that is incompatible with a secular democracy where we have freedom of religion, and where different religions and non-religions, also ideologies, also atheists, have to live side by side. And the point is that you do not have a right to impose your values or your taboos on other people, and I believe that was in fact what we were up against, during that crisis.
How unique is the United States with regard to the protection of free speech?
It's very unique, and unfortunately, it's getting more and more unique. In the sense that I'm a great admirer of the First Amendment. And I would very much like to see a First Amendment on a global level, because the First Amendment, gives the right to free speech a special status within the constitutional system. It is a right that cannot be balanced against other rights. It's absolute. In Europe and in other parts of the world, you balance the right to free speech against other rights. For instance, the right not to be offended in certain circumstances. So the United States is unique, and unfortunately the global trend is that the United States is getting more and more isolated with its legal approach to free speech. But I will not, idealize the U.S. when it comes to the practicing of free speech, because there is a lot of social pressure trying to limit free speech in the U.S., especially on campuses where you have speech codes, where student associations goes to great length in order to make people who say something that they don't like to shut up and take action against them.
Your book does talk about, of course, the depictions of the Prophet Muhammad that you chose to publish, but you also talk about Hindu nationalism and in Russia, the Orthodox Church. What happened in those instances that concerns you?
Well, if we take the Hindu nationalists first, maybe the most important or most famous Indian artist in the second half of the 20th century, Maqbool Fida Hussain. He passed away a few years ago, but he was still alive when this happened. At some point in his career, he is a Muslim. He started to paint naked Shiva goddesses, from Hinduism. And it resulted in several court cases, threats to his life, and finally in 2006, I think, he had to leave India at the age of 91 years old. So he fled to Dubai and to London, and in fact he died abroad. And the Hindu nationalists are trying to protect their faith, which is basically also here in a political ideology, against criticism, and the Russian Orthodox Church. I have an example in my book that took place a few years ago in Moscow at the Sakharov Museum, and they featured an exhibition called "Religion, Be Careful." Because they wanted to focus on the problem of how religion started to be more aggressive and demanding, respect, that people were not allowed to challenge religious dogma the way they had earlier. And it was it's a private institution. I mean, you can go, you are free not to go and see those images. But within a few days, a group of very offended Orthodox Christians showed up, and they basically destroyed the exhibition. They destroyed the pieces of art, and they destroyed the room where the exhibition took place. And a guard called the police, and they showed up, and they arrested the perpetrators. And you would think, end of story. But within a couple of weeks, charges were being dropped against the perpetrators of this crime, and instead charges were being brought against the curator and the museum of the director for incitement to religious hatred, and they were later convicted. And to me, this is a story that makes it very clear what happened in a world when you eradicate the distinction between words and deeds. It's going on all around the world, also in the West, unfortunately, where words are being perceived as offensive, as a violent criminal action. And when you do that, when you eradicate this important distinction, you are not able to distinguish a perpetrator from a victim. They shifted places in this case.
How do you evaluate on college campuses? You were describing this, and I'm thinking of college campuses in the United States. How do you evaluate that problem of, in some ways, equating words with violent acts?
I find it outrageous, and I find it, diametrical to what higher education is about. It's about reason. It's about that your own prejudices, your own opinions, your knowledge is being challenged through education. You have to acquire new knowledge, and you do that by being able to engage in discussions, in debates. So I mean, I think it's undermining the educational system in a way that you try to limit people's right to speak their mind in a free and open debate.
What does it mean when a country prioritizes dignity above the freedom of speech?
It means that you delegate the right to determine what should be allowed to be said to the one who is an object of speech. I mean, it gives a tool to those who would like other people to shut up, because they can just play the offense card and say, what you just said, I disagree with it, and I think it's offensive, and it violates my dignity. So you would have to shut up. And that is a widely held understanding in European constitutions, especially in Germany, for obvious historical reasons. Even though I disagree with that approach. So while in United States you have more focus on the autonomy of the individual, that if you limit an individual's right to speak his mind, you attack in a way his humanity, because it's part of our autonomy that we have a right to say what we want. We have a language instinct as human beings. So and we live through stories. We listen to stories. We tell stories. We grow up through stories. So when you start to limit the right to express yourself, you're not only committing a political crime, you're also committing a crime against what I would say human nature, as Salman Rushdie put it to me when I interviewed him some years ago.